Hi, this is Phil Leach, and in this teaching we're looking at Hebrew poetry and the Psalms. In this part we want to particularly look at the element of Hebrew poetry known as Semantic Parallelism. This is something I'll explain in a few moments. But before we get there, just to point out that when it comes to the relationship between poetry and prose in the Old Testament, 1/3 of the Old Testament is in poetic form. So you can see how important it is, if we're going to be good Bible interpreters, that we understand the various characteristics of Hebrew poetry. This is true, of course, for wisdom literature and for many of the prophets. The prophets, most of them are in poetic verse. There's only 5 books in the Old Testament that don't have any poetry in them. Leviticus, Ruth, Esther, Haggai, and Malachi. All of the others at least have some poetry, and for some of them it is the whole book. So again, it's really important that we understand the nature of Hebrew poetry. For much of church history, Hebrew poetry in the Old Testament was not identified or recognized. If you look at the translation, the King James or the Authorized Translation of the Bible, you'll find the Old Testament does not identify Hebrew poetry. Rather, poetry and prose is presented the same. But in the more recent translations, the poetry was recognized, is recognized, and you'll know this because of the layout that is different. Now, the thing that made the difference here was that in 1753, Bishop Robert Lowth, he was the one who brought this to the attention of the church. And in his studies, he talked about semantic parallelism, and he said it can be identified because of correspondence and equity between parts of the sentence. Now, we'll explore that in a few moments. So semantic parallelism is what he identified, and he identified 3 different kinds of semantic parallelism. The first one I want to introduce to you is what he called synonymous parallelism. This is when the second line of a poetic verse repeats the thought of the first line, but only in different words. So for Hebrew poetry, it's not so much rhyme and meter, but rather what we could call thought rhyme. This is identified in both couplets and triplets, but mostly couplets, as we will see. Let's give an example of synonymous parallelism. Psalm 19 verse 1. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. And what I want you to notice is how the second line is a repeat of the first line, only using different words. So the heavens parallels the firmament. The same idea, but in different words. Are telling parallels proclaims. And the glory of God parallels his handiwork. And so in this verse we see a good example of what is called synonymous parallelism, where the second line repeats the thought of the first line, but only in different words. Let's have some other examples. Psalm 114 is a good example of synonymous parallelism. In fact, the whole psalm is in synonymous verse. So we see verse 1, when Israel went out of Egypt, then the second line, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language. Judah, verse 2, became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. And you'll see how these lines parallel one another. When Israel, the house of Jacob, when out of Egypt, parallels from a people of strange language. And then we see the same in the next verse. Judah parallels Israel, became his sanctuary, parallels his dominion. And so we see beautifully balanced synonymous parallelism. The same with verse 3 and 4. The sea looked and fled, Jordan turned back. Verse 4, the mountains skipped like rams and the hills like lambs. The sea parallels Jordan. Looked and fled parallels turned back. Verse 4, the mountains parallels the hills. Skipped like rams parallels like lambs. And so again, you see this parallel of thought. So it's not sound rhyme, but thought rhyme. As a young believer, I would read the Psalms and other poetic verses in the scripture, and I realized that they didn't rhyme. None of them rhymed. Of course, I understood that not all poetry does rhyme, but often it does, some kind of rhyme in sound. But then I thought, oh, it's because it's translated from Hebrew, and therefore the sound, the rhyme sound, has been lost in translation. But actually, that is not the way Hebrew poetry works. It works through thought rhyme rather than sound rhyme. So in one sense, it is translatable, at least to a large extent, as we see here. Now, before we go on and look at the other two kinds of parallelism, semantic parallelism, that Bishop Loweth identified, just to help talk for a few moments, help you with the use of different terms that are used in poetry and particularly Hebrew poetry. And so the first level is the line level, that is just a simple line. And sometimes this is known as a stick. Now, for us English, it would we would think it would be pronounced stitch, but it's not, it's stick. So sometimes it's called a stick, and this might or may not be a complete sentence, but that is the first level. The second level is what is known as a couplet level. And that is where you have two lines that are semantically related to one another. Sometimes they're called distic or sometimes bicolon, but a couplet consists of these two adjacent lines, and as I said, they're related to each other by form or by content, and you see that there in Psalm 1 verse 2. More rarely, we have three lines that are related like this, and this is known as a triplet or a tri-stick or tricolon. And a good example is Psalm 1, and those three lines there you see are related to one another through synonymous parallelism. There's three lines rather than two. The equivalent of a paragraph in poetry is known as a stanza, and sometimes a strophe. And what this is a group of couplets that constitute a sense unit within the poem. And so, as I said, it's the poetic equivalent of a paragraph, where you get a group of sentences that relate together to make up a particular idea. And in Psalm 1, here related to the ESV breaks, we have two stanzas. Psalm 1 and verse 2, one stanza, 3 and 4, another stanza. Not only is it content, but also it's by form as well. In other words, a poetic form would also at different times indicate the stanza breaks. One other feature that is lost to us in translation does have to do with the balance between the lines. In Hebrew poetry, each line has the same number of word units. Most couplets have 3 major stressed word units in each line, and so you get a 3+3 pattern. So just to give you an example of this, we do it in English, the examples in English, and of course it takes multiple words in English to translate one Hebrew word, and so you'll note that. Psalm 3 verse 2, Yahweh, how many are my foes? You see what would be in Hebrew 3 words. Multitudes are rising up against me. Again, those what would be in Hebrew 3 words. So you get the 3+3. Another example in English would be the one we've already used, Psalm 19 verse 1. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Again, we get this picture of the 3+3. Interestingly, some couplets have unbalanced lines of 3+2 word units, and this is identified and known as a lament meter. And so when we look at poems of lament, often this meter is used, and it helps create the atmosphere of the poem when the second line stops short. So this dominates the book of Lamentations, and as we will see in Psalms, there's a number of lament psalms. Now, just moving on, I want to talk a bit about how our Bibles format poetry, because the translators have done us a great service in the way they've laid out our Bibles. As I said, this is not true for the King James Version, but the more modern translations, if they're not paraphrases, have tried to identify the various lines in Hebrew poetry. And this is really helpful to see how they've done this. So for regular prose, just straight writing, you'll notice how the justification is hard up on the left there, unless it's a paragraph. A new paragraph is maybe indented, as you can see on the example. When it comes to the formatting of poetry, you'll notice that it's laid out very differently. And there's 3 different options of indentations, and each one of these has been carefully chosen. The first has to do with the first line. The first line of the poetic verse is hard up against the left margin, but because many of our Bibles are in columns, the columns are not wide enough for these sentences. And so there's another kind of indentation where we could call it a double indentation, where the remaining words of a particular line are indented twice, and you can see that. You have entered into the springs of the sea, and the 2 words the sea don't fit in the column, so it is wrapped around and indented twice. But the second line of the poetic verse is indented once, and that is what's helpful for us when we're looking for synonymous or other kinds of parallelism. Whether it's 2 lines or whether it's 3 lines, you'll see that there's this indentation either hard up against the left for the first line and then the next lines of those poetic couplets or triplets are indented once. Okay, so let's talk about the second kind of parallelism which Bishop Lowe identified, and this he called antithetic parallelism. This is where the two portions of the verse stand not in repetition, but rather in contrast. And often the second line is a negative statement in relationship to the first line. Usually, but not always, the second line starts with the word but, and you'll particularly see this in Proverbs. So, an example, Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So you can see there's a deliberate semantic parallelism there, but rather it's a contrast rather than a repetition of thought. Another example is Proverbs 10 verse 1. A wise child makes a glad father, but a foolish child is a mother's grief. Sometimes antithetic and synonymous parallelism are combined, as you would expect in a particular art form like this. Isaiah 1:3. We have two synonymous parallel couplets, but in relationship to one another, they're antithetic. The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's crib. A perfectly balanced, synonymous couplet. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Again, a perfectly balanced, synonymous couplet. But in relationship to one another, they are antithetic. So the third kind that was identified by Bishop Lowe was what he called synthetic parallelism, or some call it formal parallelism. This is where the corresponding terms do not line up neatly. The two lines do have a formal relationship identified by rhythm or line length, the 3 plus 3, as we mentioned earlier, but the first line is not repeated in the second, but rather it is continued in the second, or indeed the third line. So the couplet contains only one complete sentence, not two parallel sentences, as in other types of parallelism, as we often see. The two lines are parallel in form, i.e. the 3 plus 3 or the 3 plus 2 form, as I've mentioned, but not in understanding, in meaning. Let's have a look. Psalm 51 verse 3. Then I will teach transgressors your ways. And then that's continued, that thought is continued. And sinners will return to you. Psalm 23 verse 5. This has many formal parallelism couplets in this psalm. And here's an example. Psalm 23 verse 5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Psalm 103 verse 13. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. Again, you'll see how this thought is continued in the second line rather than repeated. So just to summarize, what we have here is a very definite art form in this poetry. There's balance and symmetry between the 2 or 3 lines, and what happens is the second line increases the impact of the statement. It's as if you're viewing something from 2 different angles through the different lines that are written. And as we will see in the next teaching, there's always freedom within the form, as in any art form. It's not monotonous, but rather it's a meditation. Hebrew poetry, like all poetry, is written to be read contemplatively, and thoughtfully as you read one line and then get a different perspective through the second line. And the 2 points together say more than each individually. And the consensus today is that the second line isn't simply a repeat, but often it adds just another perspective or another angle on what has already been said.